November 3rd, 1942. 1:30 in the afternoon, the Egyptian desert. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel is staring at a piece of paper that has just been handed to him by his radio officer. The tent is hot, stiflingly hot, but Rommel feels cold. He reads the words again and again. This isn't a strategic update. It isn't a report on fuel supplies. It is, for all intents and purposes, a death sentence for 50,000 men. The message ends with 3 words that will shatter his faith in the Third Reich forever: victory or death. At this exact moment, 1,000 British tanks are smashing through his lines, and Adolf Hitler has just ordered the Desert Fox to commit mass suicide. To understand why this moment broke him, you have to understand who Rommel was. He wasn't just a general, he was a myth. The Desert Fox. The man who could turn defeat into victory with a single brilliant maneuver. But here at El Alamein, the magic had run out. There was no room to maneuver. There was no fuel for his tanks. And now, the man he had sworn an oath to serve, the man who had made him a hero, was asking him to sacrifice his army on the altar of ego. This video isn't just about a battle. It's about the minute-by-minute account of the psychological collapse of Germany's greatest commander and the radio message that turned a loyal soldier into a conspirator. Let's look at the board. El Alamein was a trap, a geographical straitjacket. To the north, you have the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, the Qattara Depression, a massive salt marsh filled with quicksand that would swallow a tank whole. Between them lay a 40-mile strip of hard desert. This was the only place in North Africa where you couldn't flank. You couldn't drive around the enemy. You had to go through them. For a commander like Rommel, who relied on speed and surprise, this was a nightmare. He was forced into a slugging match, a war of attrition. And attrition is a game of math, a game Rommel was destined to lose. The math was terrifying. By October 1942, the Panzer Army Africa was starving. The Royal Navy and the RAF were strangling the supply lines from Italy. For every 3 ships sent to Rommel, 2 were sinking to the bottom of the Mediterranean. His tanks were running on fumes. His artillery shells were rationed. German soldiers were eating captured British rations because their own supplies hadn't arrived in weeks. Rommel wrote to his wife Lou, complaining that his army was living hand-to-mouth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the line, the British were receiving Liberty ships full of American Shermans, Spam, and chocolate. It was a poverty-stricken army fighting a billionaire. And the British had a new commander, Bernard Law Montgomery, Monty. He wasn't like the gentleman generals Rommel had humiliated in the past. Monty was cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. He didn't care about being clever, he cared about winning. He waited. He refused to attack until he had overwhelming superiority. By late October, he had amassed over 1,000 tanks against Rommel's 200. He had 1,000 artillery guns against Rommel's few hundred. He told his officers, "We will hit the enemy for 6. We will crush him." He wasn't planning a battle, he was planning an execution. Rommel shouldn't have even been there. In September, he had collapsed. Chronic stomach issues, liver problems, high blood pressure. The man was a physical wreck. He had been flown home to a hospital in the Austrian Alps to recover. But when the British offensive, Operation Lightfoot, began on October 23rd, Hitler called him. He asked if Rommel felt well enough to return. Rommel, ignoring his doctors, got out of bed. He flew straight back into the inferno. He arrived on the evening of October 25th to find his headquarters in chaos. His temporary replacement, General Stumm, had died of a heart attack during a bombing raid. The situation was already critical. For 10 days the battle raged. It was a meat grinder. The British artillery fired non-stop. They called it a barrage, but it was more like an earthquake. Under this curtain of fire, British engineers cleared paths through Rommel's minefields, the so-called Devil's Gardens. Rommel tried to counterattack. He threw his 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions at the British spearheads. But every time a German tank moved, it was spotted by the RAF and bombed. The sky belonged to the British. By November 2nd, the Afrika Korps had 35 tanks left. 35. Against 600 operational British tanks. The line was breaking. Rommel was a soldier, not a fanatic. He knew when a battle was lost. On November 2nd, he made the only military decision possible. He ordered a retreat to the Fuhrer line, a defensive position 60 miles to the west. It was the only way to save the corps of his veterans. He sent a detailed report to the Commando Supremo in Rome and to Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg. He explained that the front had collapsed, ammunition was gone, and annihilation was imminent. He didn't ask for permission, he informed them of his action. He started moving the transport trucks west. He assumed Berlin would want to save the army. He was wrong. The withdrawal began. But then, a message came from the German High Command. Wait. They wanted him to hold his position until the Fuhrer reviewed the situation. Rommel, frustrated but obedient, paused the retreat. He waited. For 24 hours, the Afrika Korps sat exposed in the open desert while the British regrouped for the kill. That delay was costly. Every hour they sat there, the British were moving around their flanks. Rommel paced his tent, checking the sky for bombers, waiting for the authorization that he was sure would come. He thought Hitler just needed to see the map. It arrived at 1:30 p.m. on November 3rd. Rommel took the paper. He expected a reluctant approval to withdraw. Instead, he read this. To Field Marshal Rommel, it is with trusting confidence in your leadership and the courage of the German-Italian troops under your command that the German people and I follow the heroic struggle in Egypt. The message started with flattery, but then it turned delusional. In the situation in which you find yourself, there can be no other thought but to stand fast, yield not a yard of ground, and throw every gun and every man into the battle. The message went on to promise air reinforcements that Rommel knew didn't exist. It was a fantasy. But it was the final sentence that broke him. As to your troops, you can show them no other road than that to victory or death. Signed, Adolf Hitler. Rommel stood there, stunned. He later told his wife, I felt like I had been struck in the face. This wasn't a military order. It was the raving of a madman. Victory or death meant nothing when you have no gas and no ammo. It just meant death. Every officer in the tent stared at him. They knew that obeying this order meant the slaughter of every man under their command. You have to understand the psychology of a German field marshal. They were bound by a sacred oath, the Fahnenheid, sworn directly to Adolf Hitler. For generations, the Prussian military code dictated that obedience was the highest virtue. Rommel had risen to power because of Hitler's favor. He was Hitler's favorite general. Breaking that bond wasn't just a career move, it was a shattering of his entire worldview. For a few hours, the disciplinarian won out over the tactician. Rommel did the unthinkable. He canceled the retreat. He ordered his men to dig in and die where they stood. The result was immediate and horrific. The order to stand fast turned the Afrika Korps into sitting ducks. The British artillery zeroed in on the stationary lines. The Royal Air Force descended like vultures. The German infantry, who had started to pull back, were forced to turn around and reoccupy foxholes that were already targeted. The 15th Panzer Division was effectively wiped out in an afternoon. It was a massacre. Rommel watched from his command post as his army evaporated. He knew he was committing a crime against his own men, but he felt paralyzed by the order from Berlin. The despair was total. General von Thoma, commanding the Afrika Korps tanks, couldn't take it anymore. He radioed Rommel, "I have no tanks left." Then, he did something that showed the depth of the crisis. He climbed into one of the last remaining tanks and drove straight toward the British lines. He was seeking death. He wanted to die in battle rather than watch this senseless slaughter. His tank was hit and set on fire. He survived, standing beside the burning wreck amidst a sea of dead bodies, until the British 10th Hussars drove up and captured him. The commander of the German armor had effectively committed suicide by cop. The next day, November 4th, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring flew in. Kesselring was the commander-in-chief South, a man known for his eternal optimism. He was nicknamed Smiling Albert. But there were no smiles that day. Rommel practically dragged him to the situation map. He shouted at him, pointing to the gaps where divisions used to be. "Do you see this?" Rommel demanded. "We are finished unless we move." Kesselring, seeing the catastrophe with his own eyes, finally relented. He agreed to signal Berlin that the order was impossible. But Rommel knew he couldn't wait for another telegram. The British were breaking through. On the morning of November 4th, the British tanks broke through the final defensive line. The Afrika Korps was split open. Rommel looked at the chaos and made the choice that would define his legacy. He decided that his duty to his men was higher than his duty to the Fuhrer. He turned to his operations officer and gave the order. "Retreat. We are moving west." He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for Hitler to change his mind. He simply chose to save what was left of his army. It was the first crack in the Third Reich's facade of absolute obedience. He chose life over the Führer's fantasy. The retreat was a desperate race against time. The coast road was jammed bumper to bumper, but they moved. They escaped the encirclement. However, the cost of the delay was brutal. Because they had waited 24 hours, they didn't have enough transport to move everyone. The German motorized units fled, but thousands of Italian infantry, who lacked trucks, were left behind in the desert. The Ariete division fought to the last tank and was annihilated to buy time for the Germans. Rommel saved his German corps, but he left his allies to their fate. It was a bitter, ugly survival. Rommel saved the Afrika Korps from total destruction that day. They would fight on in Tunisia for another 6 months, delaying the inevitable. But something fundamental had broken in the desert. Rommel never trusted Hitler again. That telegram, "Victory or Death," revealed to him that Hitler didn't care about strategy, or reality, or the lives of his soldiers. He only cared about his own ego. That realization was the seed that would grow into Rommel's involvement in the plot to kill Hitler 2 years later. The road to the Valkyrie conspiracy didn't start in Berlin. It started in the sands of El Alamein. Rommel disobeyed, and he survived the battle. But the shadow of that disobedience followed him. Hitler never forgot it. He viewed it as a personal betrayal, and eventually, the choice between victory or death would return to Rommel in a very personal way. 2 years later, Hitler would give him another choice: suicide or a trial that would ruin his family. Rommel chose suicide. In the end, the order he received at El Alamein was just a preview of his own fate. The desert fox died by the hand of the master he had served too well. History is full of what-ifs. If Rommel had disobeyed immediately, could he have saved the Italian divisions too? Or was the Afrika Korps doomed the moment they entered Egypt? I want to hear your take. Was Rommel a hero for disobeying, or a villain for leaving his allies behind? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to see the full story of Rommel's forced suicide, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on. I'll see you in the next one.